Will Wright. I work here for the Los Angeles chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And on behalf of the Government Outreach Committee, we're delivering a series of 3 housing panels. This is the first of those 3, led by Hava Danielson, AIA. We will also be coordinating additional discussions Monday, November 1st, and then Tuesday, November 9th. And I will make sure that we include all the information in the chat box. We encourage you all to be active participants in this conversation. Use the chat as often as you can. Ask some really pertinent questions, but do please keep yourself muted during the discussion. And then if you do have anything to add to the conversation, we will call on you. We're expecting about 75 RSVPs today, and I realize we have some Zoom traffic, so we'll get started right now with Hava Danielson, AIA. Thank you, Hava.
Good morning, and thank you. The context for our conversation this morning, which you probably know since you all RSVP'd, is the Aia Advocacy Platform, which this year is taking on the charge, House All Angelenos. This isn't a simple proposition, and as anyone involved knows, it's not one that's easy to expedite, right? There are a lot of entities and stakeholders taking on this effort with a variety of strategies. And this roundtable, we're going to try and evaluate opportunities for the creation of new housing going forward efficiently, but also at a level of quality and livability that we all desire for our city. A particular focus that we will touch on today is our miles of underutilized commercial corridors. There's a lot of optimism around the potential in our boulevards, not the least of which is that these would be sites for new housing without associated displacement of existing residents or neighborhoods. These are sites that are often already served by public transportation and are more likely to have sufficient infrastructure to serve new growth. And one of the big questions on the table here this morning, of course, is the issue of the downzoning of those commercial corridors that happened in the mid-'80s with the passage of Proposition U in 1986. It's an important conversation, and I think as we move forward, it's important for us to be thoughtful and creative in how we move ourselves out of that moment and into what we consider a new moment. I would like to introduce the panelists. We are honored this morning to have a robust group of panelists with a great deal to offer. Angie Brooks is the principal of Brooks Scarpa and is a leader in the firm's development of affordable housing and policy, as well as their leading role in the development of sustainability initiatives. Among her many awards is that of National Citizen Architect by the AIA. Jenna Hornstook is here this morning, is a Deputy Director of Planning and Land Use with the Southern California Association of Governments, as well as City Planning Commissioner in the City of Los Angeles. She spent over 2 decades dealing with issues of local land use on both the public and private sides of the issue, including stints at the CRA LA and Metro. John Kolisky is here this morning, has also distinguished himself on both the public and private side of land use issues as the author of many urban design plans and design guidelines, as well as substantial market rate and affordable housing projects. His work has been recognized with awards from both the AIA and the American Planning Association. Zev Yaroslavsky is currently the director of the Los Angeles Initiative with the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and has an illustrious career in both the Los Angeles City Council and the County Board of Supervisors during a critical time in the transformation of Southern California into the social and cultural capital it is today. And finally, Max Podemsky will be joining us. He's currently the Planning and Transportation Director for Council District 6, the Office of Council President Nuri Martinez, which has taken the lead in developing proposals for meeting our local housing goals in combination with a focus on equity and inclusion. So I'm going to begin this morning by asking each of our guests to lay out what I'd call their opening proposition. A statement that might lay out some of the history that is worth keeping in mind, but also what will be important to do differently moving forward. And I want to begin with turning to Angie Brooks, who was, as much as anyone, the instigator of these Aia Advocacy Platform points. She was going to lay out some important background to the problem of the underproduction of housing we're faced with today, and perhaps chart some ways forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Hava. I have a screen to share, so let me just make sure that is working. Can everyone see that? Is everyone seeing my screen? Okay, great. Because I think we're all here for the same goal. So I have a couple minutes and just a few images to show to set the stage for everyone. Just 50% of the developable land in LA, just under 50%, is zoned R1 single family. It's restricted to that. 75%, the image on the right, includes duplexes. So you can see that the pink zones, which are our commercial boulevards, are what's left, not very much. This is where we want to build mixed use housing. On top of that, the existing codes that we have in the city further restrict our C zones. We have FAR restrictions, and we also have height restrictions. Currently, most C parcels are height restricted if they actually exist near R1. That's actually a lot of them. Height District 1 is technically 75 feet, but not if it's near these residential areas. If it is near these residential areas, it's 25 feet is the maximum height you can build these projects. FAR was downzoned through Prop U from 3:1 to 1.5:1. So if you actually figure this out and do the math, some of the results of built form are pencil thin towers that no one would ever build. On top of that, in Los Angeles, parking does not count towards your FAR. So you could potentially build a couple floors of parking and you might have one floor left for housing or commercial, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can see that this isn't atypical. This is in Venice, the intersection of Rose and Lincoln. The pink zones are the C zones, and the yellow is our single family restrictive zone. So along what really should be a transit corridor, we have limited the ability of developers and landowners to really build any density where it should really go. And of course, our pink zones and our commercial zones is where we have transit, where we have a lot of amenities, and it's really where we have a great opportunity to provide a lot of housing. And then I have a couple examples of exactly what FAR looks like. This is a flower market, which is almost an entire city block in downtown LA. The FAR is 3.9:1, and this is a 12-story building. About 4 floors of this building are parking, and they don't even count towards the FAR. This is in Venice. This is affordable housing. The FAR is 2:1, and it's a 4-story building. This is in Santa Monica. The FAR is 1.6:1, and that is because the codes in Santa Monica define FAR as one that allows you to discount the residential floor area by 50%. So it's an incentive that they've put on top of FAR to have developers provide more housing in the downtown core. And the parking requirement just on the other side of the alley of this building is actually 0. So you can actually build dense projects, and you can see the FAR is even below 2:1. And then this is again in Los Angeles. This is Lincoln Heights. This building has an FAR of 2.4:1, and about 60% of the lot this building sits on is a parking 2-story parking garage. But this is a 6-story building. So you can see that FAR doesn't really necessarily exactly link to height, density, and kind of what the building looks like. And then these are examples of what I consider to be good density, which is that the street is actually a space and the buildings that are on either side of the street actually create a space for people. And then we know we've done a lot of studies on how we build, why we build, what we do in our existing housing stock, and we use a lot of national data. There's a mismatch between the type of home that exists and the type of household that exists. So in the US, the housing stock doesn't really match our households. 1% are studios, 40% of our existing housing stock are 3 bedrooms, even though about 80% of our families are adults that live in various combinations, and only 20% of our families are what we call actually nuclear families, 2 parents and 2 kids. And then in LA, I think over the past 30 years, not only have we been downzoning, but some people have called our codes Byzantine, and I actually say they're dystopian. If you guys have seen the recent articles about the one, this is the single family house that was built in Bel Air recently. It's 105,000 square feet with a nightclub, a bowling alley, and a spa. Construction started in 2013. It took 7 years to build, and the scale of this is just way outweighs anything that we would ever do on our commercial boulevards. And this is a picture of the corner of Venice and Lincoln. And so you can see that there's literally no development here, but the opportunity as I drive through LA, I see all this space and I just see tons of opportunity. And then this is a graph that was actually produced by UCLA PhD student Greg Morrow, which looks at the years between 1960 and 1990 and posits that the downzoning has resulted in a substantial net loss of potential housing capacity. He estimated tens of thousands of homes were not built during those years. And I estimate that it's around 500,000 based on the studies that we've done and a lot of the housing that currently exists that are what we call illegal housing, people living in dwelling units that aren't quote unquote legal. And then I've actually read the city charter because I've been really interested in a lot of these issues. And the city charter allows us to have an FAR of up to 13:1. It also allows the city council to create emergency codes to preserve peace, health, and safety. And I feel like our commercial boulevards are a great opportunity for us to provide more housing. And what are we waiting for? Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. And Hava, you can introduce the next speaker.
Yes, sorry, unmute. You wouldn't know I've been Zooming for a year now. I would like to welcome to the panel this morning Zev Yaroslavsky. I think that there are some really important issues related to how we move forward and should we densify our city and in what ways and what should we be careful about as we do move forward. So with no further ado, Zev, we want to hear your comments on this, on these proposals. You need to unmute. We all do it.
I don't know. After I finish, you may wish I hadn't. The first thing I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Chava, for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and it's a pleasure to be with my co-panelists. I think one of the most important things that we all have to do is know what the facts are and not attach ourselves to narratives that have kind of gotten traction over the last 10 or 20 years. I don't know where the concept was that, or where the fact came up that all commercial corridors that are adjacent to single family homes have a height limit of 25 feet. unless it's changed since I was a city councilman, that is not the case. I, as a councilman, proposed and got approved a number of corridors where the height limits were 45 feet, 1 VL. There are some areas which were 1L, which is 75 feet, 6 stories or 75 feet. There's one place in my district, which is 30 feet, 1XL, and that's the stretch of Melrose between Highland and Fairfax. And we wanted to keep that from becoming anything but what Melrose had become. I think that was a good thing, notwithstanding the problems we have on Melrose right now. But the rest of the city's commercial corridors in Height District 1, which is the 3-to-1, what was the 3-to-1 in 1986 was reduced to 1.5-to-1, have no height limit. So I just want to, as a fact that we need to understand. And the second thing is Proposition U, which has become kind of the boogeyman of development in the last 10 years, including Greg Morrow's dissertation, which I've read, and which I think is flawed in some very significant respects. And that is this: Proposition U, just so everyone knows what it was an initiative that reduced the Florida area ratio, the FAR, on Height District 1, that is 3-to-1 zone streets, commercial streets, neighborhood commercial serving streets throughout the city of Los Angeles. It did not apply, it did not affect the areas which were Height District 2, which are 6-to-1 FAR, Height District 3, which is 10-to-1 FAR, and Height District 4, which is 13-to-1 FAR. I don't think I need to explain that to a group of architects, so I'll stop treating you like my students. But it did not affect those at all. And it did not affect any redevelopment districts in the city. So downtown, Hollywood, parts of Van Nuys, Westwood itself, and the Wilshire Westwood area, the Westwood Community Plan area, and other high density Wilshire corridor, all the way from downtown to the Santa Monica city limit was and still is, as far as I know, Height District 2, 6-to-1 FAR. So that's for starters. So it only applied to these streets like Pico and Melrose and Fairfax and Cesar Chavez Boulevard and York Boulevard and Eagle Rock and et cetera. These are neighborhood serving commercial districts and commercial corridors. It did not affect a single property in the city of Los Angeles that was zoned residential, not one. In fact, I was the co-author of Proposition U in 1986 with my late colleague, Marvin Browdy. We were approached on it by a number of people who wanted us to include residentially zoned properties in the zoning cutback. And we said no. Our beef wasn't with residential. Our beef was with massive commercial development. And some of you are old enough to remember some of the major massive developments that took place in this city in the late 70s and early 80s, the Beverly Center, the West Side Pavilion. The city, those properties were never zoned for that kind of massive development, a 1 million square foot shopping center. I forgot how many square feet the West Side Pavilion was. And they were built by right. They did not require any discretionary action. They were built by right. There was no way we could condition them or reduce them. And there was a building in Encino called the Fujita Building, is how it was commonly known, a massive 6-story, 7-story office building. It's still there near Havenhurst and Ventura Boulevard, cast a permanent shadow on a block of modest middle-class homes, in those days, middle-class homes. And those homes were finally bought by a local religious institution to make a parking lot out of it. And those became the poster children for Proposition U, to how to reduce the impact of commercial development that was overly, you showed that beautiful picture. I think that's the Hadid development in Bel Air, which, if it is illegal, and the city ought to do something about it. And we'll, I'm sure, learn more about why the city hasn't done something about it in the weeks and months ahead. But imagine these kinds of massive projects that were huge traffic generators, Residential development is not a huge traffic generator. It's not a peak hour traffic generator. Commercial is. In the old days, pre-pandemic, people got to work at 8, 8:30, 9, and left at 5, 5:30. And so it was a real quality of life issue, a time spent in traffic issue, and the cut through traffic in neighborhoods rose up and wanted to do something about the commercial development's impact on their neighborhoods. Had nothing to do with residential. So I tell you that, and then I want to say a word about commercial corridors, because I have some pretty good ideas. I live 2 doors off of Beverly Boulevard, so I have a stake in it, and I think I can speak credibly about it. But the thing that everyone on this call should understand is Prop U is not the cause of the housing crisis, as Greg Morrow said in his dissertation. It's nonsense. We've had before 1986, there was 100 years of history in Los Angeles. We didn't have a Prop U. People did not build residential buildings on commercial properties for the most part, because you could make more money with commercial properties. The mini mall that's catty corner from my house makes more money today than he would make by tearing it down and building a 7-story apartment building. And that's why he doesn't build a 7-story apartment building. It's not economically feasible. And that was the case before 1986. And I would say to academics and architects who make arguments like this is, if you want to look at the impact of Prop U, look at the cities that, there are 88 cities in Los Angeles County. 87 of them are not governed by Prop U. And they have various FARs, but most of them are in the 3-to-1 range. Check out what other cities have experienced in the way of housing production when they weren't impacted by Prop U. And for the most part, you'll find the same thing, where commercial properties, where properties are commercially zoned, commercial properties get built. By the way, there's some cities that don't allow residential development in commercial zones, like Beverly Hills. I think they're considering changing that now. But Los Angeles does allow residential and commercial zones. Now, the last thing I want to say is, when we talk about commercial corridors, not every commercial corridor, they're not all the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Some commercial corridors are wider, like Venice Boulevard. Some are narrow, like Melrose Avenue. Some are adjacent to apartment buildings, like Santa Monica Boulevard. Some are adjacent to single-family homes. And in doing the appropriate planning and to keep neighborhoods to scale, I think that ought to be something that's taken into consideration. I don't have a specific FAR, but they ought to be taken into consideration. Now, when we wrote Prop U, we left the door open for the city council and the mayor and the planning commission to modify zoning without going back to a vote of the people. What we did was change the nomenclature. We changed the definition of Height District 1 from 3-to-1 to 1.5-to-1. That was it. I think the entire measure was 2 or 3 sentences long. That's all we did. If you wanted to rename a zone Height District 1.5 and call it 3-to-1, you could do that citywide without going back to a vote of the people. The city did that, did a version of that in the late 90s, early 2000s. They created the RAS zone, which I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with. And then there were density bonus laws that the city passed and then the state passed that gave you the ability to not only abrogate Prop U, it enabled you to go beyond what the previous zoning of 3-to-1 allowed for residential, if you were to build residential. But it demanded something in exchange. It demanded that the property owner or the developer set aside a percentage of the units for affordable housing. Now, Prop U has been on the books since 1986. We are as far away from 1986 as 1950 was from 1986. There's been 2 generations of people. The economics of Prop U have been baked into real estate for a long time. If we're going to upzone any part of or increase the FAR in any part of these commercial corridors, we ought to get something in return for it. The society should get something in return for it. With a stroke of the pen, we'll increase the value of a piece of property. Some of that value ought to be captured and reinvested back in affordable housing. That's not a radical idea, and it's not an untested idea. We just need to find out what that sweet spot is. That's exactly what's happened. The old Fairfax silent movie theater, which many of you may be familiar with, was torn down and redeveloped as a six give or take 6-story building. It's 4.5 to 1 FAR on a street that was zoned 1.5 to 1 by Prop U, and prior to Prop U was 3 to 1. It went up to 4.5 to 1 with various density bonuses that the city and the state have passed. So there are ways, even today, not only to exceed 1.5 to 1, but to exceed 3 to 1. Now, if the issue is to change the commercial corridors with one fell swoop, then the one thing I would suggest, and I'm not going to speak any longer, I could go on forever, as my friends know. If you're going to increase the FAR in commercial corridors, increase it for residential, not for commercial.
Mhm.
And the problem I have with people who have proposed repealing of Prop U is that they don't want to repeal it just for residential. They want to repeal it for commercial as well. And that gets us back to what caused us to have Prop U in the first place. We don't need more commercial development. Ground floor retail, neighborhood serving commercial uses, that's what the C2 and C1 zones were for. But to go back, to build a 6 and 7-story building, half of which might be commercial, all of which might be commercial if you repeal Prop U, that doesn't get us anywhere in the way of housing. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Zev. Thank you for all of that. You've raised a lot of important points, and possibly the most important one is what do we get in return, and how do we use this tool to get us to what we're trying to get to, which is house all Angelinas. How do we get to the affordable housing and use this as an opportunity to solve what is currently a crisis in front of us, and not simply open up the floodgates, I guess, as you would say. With that note, we are still in our opening salvos. I'm going to turn the microphone over to John Kolisky, who has, I think, a unique and important perspective, having worked vigorously on both sides of the public-private divide on this issue, and has studied Boulevards for many years. And thank you very much, John, for being with us.
Well, thank you, Hava, and thank you everybody for coming here, and especially my fellow panelists, many of whom I've worked with at one time or another. And what's amazing about a conversation like this is that I listened to Angie, and then I listened to former Councilman and Supervisor Yaroslavsky, and I think, well, gosh, I agree with everything both of them are saying. And how does one reconcile this? And in many ways, that mimics how projects are created. And then I think of somebody like Jenna, who I've worked with, and I mean, I've watched projects go through her grinder that had just absolutely the best of intentions in them in terms of design and everything else, get just ground apart in the public process and then miraculously put back together again and created. And there's so many of my friends here too today that it's quite wonderful. So anyway, Hava, you asked me 3 questions. I'm just going to attend to those questions, and then I'm sure the conversation will go where we want it to go, because I think a lot of what we're talking about is theory versus real politics, and what happens in real politics when you hit the ground running and have to deal with many, many, many diverse points of view and find some type of exquisite and sometimes exquisitely painful balance. So you asked me about the issue of simple incentives not being sufficient to support the projects the city needs, and you pointed out one of them about 1.5 to 2.175 somehow not penciling out. On this one, I have to sort of say I kind of come down where Zev is, because in our own practice, what I see is that the 1.5 FAR really never limits us. If somebody wants to do something, they do it. The thing that limits is probably more how complicated it is to get through the process than what the rules actually are, and I'm not sure it's the FAR as much as the process. But in that particular respect, I would just say that the city does not do enough economic and form-based modeling as part of their planning process. They do a lot more than they used to, but given the power of the computational tools that we now have distributed amongst us, much more predictive modeling could be done. The idea that all these folks are promoting today are admirable and all being thrown into the pot more or less based upon preference rather than substantive research. For instance, as regards the 2.175 FAR, it works fine in certain neighborhoods that are not considered location, and is more of a challenge in locales where land gets more expensive and perhaps more of a challenge about metro rail stops. But if the market is strong, 2.175 still achieves a pretty dense project, particularly if it is loaded with open space amenities. Hines proved this. It didn't get built, by the way, and the desirability of this some years ago in Santa Monica, you'll remember where the Papermate project was, a pretty dense project rising up to 6 and 7 stories with a lot of open space, a lot of amenities. It would have been pretty interesting, and I think the maximum density they ever got to on that was in the around 2.25 or so. And we know from recent work that our office has done in Santa Barbara that 2 to 2.75, even in a very, very expensive place, can lead to the production of housing and to the production of inclusionary housing at around 15 to 20%. So for me, the issue is not to make a blanket statement about what we think works, but to do the homework up front to facilitate what works. If the FAR needs to be higher in circumstances, I am for that, but the reverse is that citywide prescriptives may not be needed to achieve a next generation of density if the development parameters are understood and parsed. You also asked me about creating neighborhoods so that they are, or boulevards, that they're pedestrian environments. I think this is the issue, for me at least, and follows from your first question. There may be locations where the linear city makes perfect sense, or 3 or 4 story boulevards make sense, or even high-rise boulevards make sense. But lines have to be complemented by points, and points by circles, and circles by thicknesses based upon context and circumstance. To date, Los Angeles has typically had singular ideas from the geography and considered the city as a whole when general plans are undertaken and completed. Perhaps that is changing now with Hollywood and downtown and even Warner Center, but the path seems, of course, too slow and mostly reactionary to present circumstances rather than anticipatory. And that's what I'm interested in, being anticipatory. The question that gets answered most of the time is, how do we accept growth where growth is going already, as opposed to where do we want growth and how do we get it? The latter is more difficult and political to answer, but it is the more challenging and correct approach given the multitude of urban design issues that face us. And finally, you asked, what is the correct balance between the efficiency of the market and the need for planning intervention to ensure affordability of new projects? I think, at least from my point of view, that within the answers to the first 2 questions or the answers to the third, we need more quantitative and data-driven planning. Our planning department and the profession is starting to do this, but we still need more resources and more commitment to this type of approach to make it effective. And we need to stop thinking about planning and urban design and the architecture of cities as one size fits all, one idea fits all, and one approach fits all. Architects have a tendency to do this, and if they're need to take political positions, and in their need to take political positions, politicians have to do this. So I guess in the end, Prop U, though responsive to the needs of perhaps a majority of Angelenos at the time, was seen by some, including me, as an egregious example of one-size-fits-all ballot box planning that would lead and did lead to consequences that in some small ways have hamstrung the ability of local leaders and planners to do more and accommodate more housing and urban vitality in some specific places. I don't think that that type of idea was perhaps good, but in retrospect, I kind of agree with Zev. It really didn't make that much difference. I think the interesting thing for me now is there's still a chance that there'll be more ballot box planning and state planning about local issues. I think that's really not a good idea. I tend to really still believe in the utopian of local people getting themselves together and planning for what they want, and that the real issues for me are organizing about social issues, justice issues, equity issues, and insisting that those be part of the conversation when we talk about land use and planning. So where I would sort of close this is that as I've gotten sort of towards the end, I guess, of doing this type of stuff, I actually find it to be both more exciting and more confusing than ever, because there ain't no one answer fits all circumstances. And if I could do one thing at all, and maybe this is self-serving, it would be to increase the resources of our planning department, which I think is infinitely stronger than it was when I was at the CRA, to basically do more real data-driven and quantitative planning, which would allow them, and actually more community-based planning, which would allow them to engage in, I think, much more successful conversations, which would in turn lead, given what the issues of this moment are, probably to much, much better outcomes than we've had in the past.
Thank you, John. That's also raises a host of questions around this balance of, allowing the production of housing to be by right to be affordable, right, to construct, and yet resulting in a kind of city that we all want to live in, right? And to what extent do we allow the market to drive it, and to what extent do we have to intervene in order to get the city that we want to live in? At this point, I want to turn the microphone to Jenna Hornstock from SCAG and also the City Planning Commission, who I believe is going to give us some good news or some view into some of the efforts that are underway and some of the ways we might be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Hava. I do have a list of some thoughts about what's happening on the ground right now. I mean, and listening to my fellow panelists, some things I'd like to add, but I feel like I need to start where we started with the framing of this. And I want to consider this a calling in and not a calling out, but I have a hard time with how we're characterizing Prop U. Intention doesn't matter. You need to recognize harm. And Prop U caused harm, and it caused us to preclude housing from being built in high opportunity areas. And these are racial harm, and this is socioeconomic harm. And intention doesn't matter. As John noted, I have been yelled at by so many different people in this city working in redevelopment and affordable housing over the years. And what I pride myself on is taking responsibility for outcomes regardless of intention. The fact is that Prop U was purposefully, interpreted to include housing. There's lore, and I would love to hear from Mr. Yaroslavsky if this is true. There is lore that originally Prop U was interpreted by the city attorney to not include housing, meaning it only reduced FAR for commercial, but that Mr. Yaroslavsky himself made sure it was also applied to housing. This is lore. I don't know if it's true. It did restrict housing to be built. It's not true. Thank you. I appreciate that because I know
Never heard that before.
I heard it, and I guess the point is, whatever the intention was, the outcome is when the market did shift, because markets do shift. In 1986, maybe nobody was building housing on commercial corridors, but when the markets shift, as John noted, it was impossible to build housing on corridors because of a multitude of issues, but largely that wealthier, whiter folks don't want to see density and they don't want to see change. And so when we made it impossible to build housing in these high opportunity areas, the process itself precluded it. Even with the attempt of Jane Blumenthal and amazing planners to do the RAS zone, I was in the mayor's office when that came through. The reality is it set off in motion what had a large part in causing our housing crisis. No one thing caused it, but it is a huge part of it. And to not acknowledge that, it concerns me, and it doesn't mean the intention was to cause the housing crisis, but we have to acknowledge the impact to move forward because the narratives that carry forward with the slow growth movement are still there. They're still there, and it's not about a single person, but it is rooted in exclusionary land use policy and is rooted in our systemic racism and holding systems in place that protect neighborhoods that make us feel comfortable, our single family neighborhoods. And I cannot move forward in this discussion without acknowledging that. It was harm. It harmed people and it harmed our city, and I'm clearly upset about it. Because again, I've been yelled at by the best of them, and I've been called out on my intentions when I have failed, when my intentions were well put and not done correctly because I didn't listen right or I didn't listen deep enough. So, sorry, I don't know why I'm so upset this morning, but I am. So I'd like to call us in to acknowledge that there was harm, and I want to start from there. What's happening at the city that is exciting? We talked, and I didn't even have this on this list, but John, you talked about there's no one size fits all. And while imperfect, I know many of you on this call have been involved in the development of the form-based codes. And I got to be honest, I'm not an architect, and I tried to slog through that document, the form of recode, and I struggle with it. But I know that there's an effort to create parameters and understand scale and understand communities through the form-based code. So I'm hopeful that it's going to make sense. I think there will be mistakes. I think there will be challenges implementing it because you can't get anything that large right on the first try. But I want us all to commit to trying to work with the city and help that form-based code work. I think importantly, where the city has been successful and has proven, by the way, that there's a desire to build apartments on our commercial corridors is through things like the density bonus and the TOC ordinance, right, which have unleashed, right, have undone Prop U by unleashing development in these high resource areas, in these exact corridors where we said maybe in the 80s no one wanted to build apartments, where they certainly want to build them there now. And the TOC ordinance has not only done this and the density bonus, but they've done it with inclusionary zoning. And so, Hava, to your question, you also asked me about the market. These inclusionary programs have shown the market demand. The market has responded not just by producing low-income units, but extremely low-income units, right? I mean, I have the statistics in front of me and I'm not looking at my notes, but something around 40% of all the new permits in the city are coming in through density bonus and TOC ordinance, right? Which cover a relatively small area of the city. But the market is showing us that that is where they want to build these apartments. I think importantly, we got to talk about the linkage fee, which certainly got a lot of scrutiny, but the linkage fee that the city has, which is beyond, that's for all, commercial and residential development, says that I don't totally understand. There's a smaller bit that's for 2 to 6 units, but it generally applies at 5 and up units. And not only do you pay a fee, but the fee is scaled to the type of neighborhood. I think it's low, medium market, medium high, and high market. So they actually look at the market itself, like what is the value of that market, the property values, a number of things. And they tie your fee per square foot to what kind of market you're in. So this is a heavily market-based program. But the interesting thing about the linkage fee is it says if you build the units on site, you don't have to pay the fee. And what are people doing? They're building the units on site. So we are seeing a host of market-driven solutions coming out of our planning department and our city council and mayor's office that are trying to use the market to address harms and to create more equity and how our housing is built in the city. And then the last thing I'll note is the community plans that are coming and that are rezoning our corridors. And I mean, I've been on the planning commission since February, and oh my God, what a doozy of a year. I mean, I've had the Mellow Act, sign ordinance, Hollywood plan, downtown plan, and the housing element. Okay, since February, I don't have any life. I just read. The city is trying so hard to sort these really complicated issues out through the upzoning, and it is so difficult. And I give a lot of credit to the planning department, and actually want to give credit to the state. You mentioned resources, right? We need resources to do this planning. I mean, the state is dropping money on not sexy stuff like land use planning. I mean, like it's going out of style. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars coming from the state to help cities across the state do this land use planning. And these aren't groundbreakings. These aren't things you get political credit for. It's the hard work that we stopped doing as a state. So the city's had a bunch of resources, including a program I run at SCAG. We gave $8 million to the city to do a variety of this work, including a lot of work around affirmatively furthering fair housing and anti-displacement policy. So there is a lot out there happening that is changing Prop U, bringing back residential in these corridors. It might not be perfect, but it is rooted in efforts to bring equity and inclusion in the process. They're not perfect, but it's working, right? We're seeing the housing coming. And the last thing I want to note is Angie, it's so interesting that you mentioned at the beginning that our deficit that we lost is about 500,000 units, right, in that estimate, because the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation for the city, which has changed, now it includes existing unmet need through overcrowding, cost burden, and unbuilt housing plus population growth. Guess what that number is? It's 455,000 units in the next year. So there it is. What we downzone is why we're in our housing crisis. And it's not just Prop U, it's everything. It's AB 283, it's everything we've done. But it's there. We can solve it by bringing back the corridors. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jenna. I think you bring up a lot of important points, but a lot of the questions that I want to kind of have us dig in on a little bit later this morning is precisely how do we build back? How do we get that density? And I think that's the devil in the details there. What do those 500,000 units look like, and who are they for, right? With that, I would like to turn the microphone to Max Podemsky from Council District 6, who also has some thoughts on TOC, I understand, and also how we can hopefully build back in an equitable vision of our city.
Well, thank you so much, Hava. It's great to be here. This is a really wonderful conversation. And I just wanted to go through some slides I have, which is probably a big mistake to do a presentation to a group of architects, so don't judge it too much. But, I find I am a planner. This conversation has been very heavy on FAR and zoning, but, people don't experience FAR and zoning when they're out in the city. They experience physical structures. So I just wanted to sort of go through some pictures of some structures and talk about, the past and, what my office sees as sort of the future. So I think one of kind of an unheralded quality of LA is our commercial boulevards. Going back to the teens and 20s, LA did build, streetcar districts with small storefronts. And, this is really a characteristic that's across the city, from Granada Hills, Pacoima, South LA, Fairfax. We have these commercial boulevards that are really anchors of their communities and, contribute to the identity of those neighborhoods. And when I think about, pre-Prop ULA, I think about structures like this. We got a lot of these massive structures that in many cases erase sort of these fine-grained, neighborhood commercial corridors and really contributed nothing. This is on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks. You just get a blank wall to the street. And we're directly adjacent to, single family residential neighborhoods. So, I don't think it's a mystery why Prop U happened. I mean, I think most people who live next to this would be pretty upset by it because it's, sort of visually intrusive on their neighborhoods with, not only not contributing something, but probably in a lot of cases, taking things away, taking, commercial storefronts away, walkability, and sort of replacing it with these monoliths. And, another thing about this is, as Jenna mentioned, a lot of this took place in wealthy, wider areas of the city. So, places like Ventura Boulevard in the Valley, the West Side, the Miracle Mile. So to me, it totally makes sense, why we had a backlash to this type of growth. And now we sort of have, a new paradigm through, as Jenna mentioned, TOC and density bonus, where we're getting structures like this. This is on Motor Avenue in Palms. And buildings like this are really ridiculed. I mean, this is one that I see on the internet a lot of people saying this is incredibly, an ugly structure. But I think that there is a big difference between this and what we had before. And I think the criticism of this is largely kind of like an automobile perspective. Because I'm someone who walks around the city a lot, and especially during COVID. And these buildings, in a lot of cases do contribute to their neighborhoods. This is the ground floor of that building. You can see, they planted trees. The sidewalk is usually wider. It's smooth and they have storefronts. And then, one thing that's happened since COVID is you've had parklets and things like this go into the sidewalk. So it sort of humanizes the street, contributes to that community. It's not perfect. I mean, it's got this big parking podium. It often has the doors to the parking garages directly on the street. But I think that this is in some ways a positive step forward. And this building, on Motor Avenue in Palms, it's a landscape that, looked like the photo that Angie showed of Venice Boulevard of, just parking lots and strip malls, and it's sort of been morphing into more of a pedestrian oriented area, you know, like we traditionally have had in the city. But I think, you know, a problem and the criticism, you know, that Jenna mentioned is, you know, these buildings can be sort of problematic in a different way. And just want to push back on John's point a little bit about how we're having, you know, development, you know, to plan and where development is going. But we can see from this map, and this is showing where affordable housing stock has gone in the city over the last 20 years, but it really can be a proxy for sort of all development. You know, the red or yellow areas are where development is going. It's really only going in the central city, South LA. And then you have a little blip up here in the San Fernando Valley, which is our district and Council District 6. So I think this is one of the lasting repercussions of Prop U, is that with Prop U, it seemed like we were getting the development on the west side in our job-rich areas. And since then, we've really pushed growth to lower income communities of color, places that have historically been redlined. And that TOC structure, you know, I showed is sort of like an alien ship landing, and, you know, a building coming in, oftentimes replacing, you know, RSO units, or replacing, you know, a grocery store or a neighborhood serving use with, you know, a cafe, and bringing different residents, even though it has percentage of affordable. That's really, you know, seen as a threat and seen as being unequitable. But we do have a huge opportunity now, which is our RHNA process. So, you know, the state has given the city of LA 450,000 units of housing that we need to build by 2030. And our planning department has done a really serious job doing this, and, you know, enlisted the Turner Center and actually did a study of how many parcels would actually turn over or have the potential to be redevelopment in that time period, which means that we don't even just have to rezone for 450,000 units. We actually have to rezone for multiples of that in order to actually produce that many units. And this is something that the council president has taken very seriously. And we wrote a 7-page letter to the planning department on the housing department with different goals and priorities, which was co-signed by 6 other council people. And one of the main priorities was this equity issue, you know, making sure that we are rezoning in those job-rich, high opportunity areas, you know, places with the best climate, best access to transportation, and most jobs, and not just in low-income communities of color, which is what we have historically done, with which that map showed before. And also looking at things like expanding our TOC program, which has been extremely successful. It was, you know, a ballot box planning, but it was successful. And it's created, you know, 20,000 units of housing and about 5,000 units of affordable housing since 2016. So how can we look on at expanding these incentive programs to more places? And it does also look at things like restoring FAR and commercial boulevards. But it also looks at something which was, you know, in our letter of missing middle housing, you know, traditional affordable housing stock like bungalow courts that we can put in neighborhoods as well. So this is a really huge opportunity. I think, you know, because of everything else that's been going on, it's kind of fallen under the radar. But this is really going to, you know, shape the city for many years to come. But I think it really is essential that we improve that design, especially of those TOC structures, or else we risk having another Prop U potentially. You know, we need to build buildings that integrate into the community, and that at the end of the day, people see those buildings as contributing to their neighborhoods and not being extractive. And so that's, I think, you know, why I'm so happy why AIA is engaging in this, and I hope you will continue to engage in this to help sort of craft these policies, because the housing element went to CPC. Hopefully the council will vote on it by the end of the year, if not in January. And then we have till 2025 to actually implement these zoning ordinances. And so that's sort of where we're going to get, into the nitty gritty about design and how this happens. And I'm hoping that that can be a really broad conversation and use LA's tremendous design expertise to create that. So thank you.
Thank you, Max. I'm really happy you showed that picture of that building in Sherman Oaks. I think that kind of gets to the heart of the complex part of this conversation, right? The easy part of this conversation is we need to build more housing. We have a homelessness problem. We have a housing crisis. That's the easy part. The complex part is how do we balance all the forces at work here to get there? And I think it's really important to not be naive about if we simply open the floodgates and we simply upzone everywhere, the market is going to move to do the most profitable thing and not necessarily the thing that's going to make us make the city better, right? And on the other hand, if there are too many overlays and too many requirements, that gets in the way of the project, of the housing being built being affordable, period. And so I think the question I want to ask, I think the issue of pushback as evidenced in what happened in 1986 is a really, really important lesson to take forward. That the housing and the development and the TOC program really does need to go into the neighborhoods that are the most resistant and the most politically connected. And it has to then be done wisely and carefully to avoid the kind of pushback and avoid the kind of uproar that happened in 1986, and for people to perceive these projects as beneficial to them and an improvement to their neighborhood. So having said that, my question is, how do we balance that? Which I'm sure there's a few people here who have an answer to that question. And in my mind, the question that I always have is, if we just build housing, aren't we just creating a worse traffic problem? Don't we need to make sure that somehow the housing is accompanied by the provision of services, the provision of open space, the provision of cultural amenities to create real neighborhoods along these boulevards, and not only solve our RHNA problem, our HNA problem. So I will open that to whomever of our panelists would like to raise their hand.
Find it. I'm looking for my raised hand. There, I'll raise my hand. Sorry. Can I get going? Okay. A couple things. I mean, in terms of, we're talking about pushback and how do we do this? I mean, there will be pushback. Human beings don't like change, right? They don't, especially if it's working for you and you own your home and it's worth a lot of money and you like your neighborhood. You just don't want it to change. So when things are done by right, or you can't stop it, like the density bonus, like the TOC ordinance, like what the Housing Accountability Act at the state level, SB 330 says, when things come to us, and I saw my fellow commissioner, Renee Dake-Wilson is on today, there are certain things we can't say no to, and we can't even, I mean, we can hear an appeal, but it has been made clear in various laws trying to undo these harms that things are going to be by right. So one level of how we deal with the pushback is we acknowledge people aren't going to like it and we keep going because we understand that we need to build the housing to support our families in the city and families of all income levels. So I think on some level we keep going with by right and the rezoning and doing what we know is right for our communities. As much as we can call people into the conversation and try to address the concerns that folks have. And that is not easy to do. But we need to talk about what is it that you don't like about this when we have the opportunity, and that needs to happen at the neighborhood council and the neighborhood level. And I recently met a woman who's doing some of this work in her own community through this livable, I think it's called Livable Streets or Livable Communities effort, where they go and they sit down and they talk to their neighbors about what could their neighborhood look like. And Chava, to your point, what folks maybe need to understand is that when we get appropriate density on our corridors, then we'll get the commercial that serves our neighborhoods so we can walk more and drive less, right? Right now, we can't support neighborhoods serving commercial in all of our single family neighborhoods because there isn't the density on the corridors that brings enough purchasing power. But if you have a neighborhood with apartments and single family and a little bit more density, then you can have the dry cleaner and the market and the drugstore and all those things, even the childcare to let you walk. So if we can understand that having a little more density on our commercial corridors near our single family neighborhoods creates neighborhood nodes that can then actually support commercial serving, or commercial serving those neighborhoods, we would have better, more livable communities where we can walk more to the basic things we do day to day. It is a misnomer to think every building can be mixed use. We can't support that much retail. There have to be nodes, right? There have to be stretches of residential and there have to be nodes of commercial. So it's a multifaceted conversation, trying to change people's hearts and minds. It's not an easy one. And the city's got to keep going with by right development and doing the rezoning with inclusionary protections that we have through our density bonus, through the TOC, to get an equity-centered development plan going.
Hey, Hava, I just raised my hand. Is it okay if I go? I just like to say I totally agree with Jenna. I think, we've worked in a lot of different places around the country, and in LA, pretty much everything is an entitlement, which means you have to ask for approvals. And the very best projects, which are designed really well, are affordable, mixed use, come against neighborhood opposition. And generally, in my experience, and I've been an architect for 25 years, it is when we try to put people who are at the margins, so poor people or transitional aged youth or people who are homeless, who need support services, the community does not want them anywhere. And when I say anywhere, I mean not next to housing, I mean next to an empty parking lot, I mean next to a school. So we need more projects that are by right. And I really think that we cannot plan by ballot measure. We need to plan, we need to do real planning in the planning department. We need to give the control of land use and planning away from ballots and away from politicians and put it into the designers' hands, architects, urban planners, who need to actually show everyone what the community is going to look like in 50 years or 100 years. What is the city going to look like in 100 years? Nobody really knows. We put transit in areas where no housing can be built. The blue line was put through industrial areas where it was illegal to build housing. We did a project near the blue line many years ago and changed the zoning for one parcel just to build housing near one of the transit stops. And then the city of Long Beach then upzoned or rezoned the boulevards. We put the gold line through Lincoln Heights, where it's hard to build housing in industrial areas. All of these links need to be tied together. And I really think it needs to be in the realm of the urban planners and architects and designers who are going to show us what this looks like. And then it goes through the political process and the communities to say, hey, everybody, here's the infrastructure. Here's what it's going to look like. What do you think? And then go through the process. But right now it's just sort of happening piecemeal, and the state comes down and says, we have SB 9, we have SB 10, and the state's doing this because we aren't building enough housing. So I think part of it is giving the ability to design our city of what it's going to look like in 100 years to the people who can actually show us what that's going to look like.
It looks like we lost Hava. So Zev, I would love to have you respond. Jenna had a lot of passion. I respect your leadership, and we're all here in this together. So we would love a little additional insight and context as well.
Well, I respect Jenna's point of view. I really don't think I need to say more than what I said at the outset. Prop U is blamed for a lot of things, and to blame it for today's housing crisis. Remember, these commercial strips that were rezoned by Prop U are a fraction of the real estate of the city of Los Angeles. The overwhelming majority of the city of Los Angeles is zoned residential. It could be single family, it could be multiple, it could be R3, 4, 5. The strip commercial streets, if you add up the square footage, are a scintilla of a percentage of what the landmass of the city is. So the only thing I would say is there are parts of the city that did not have Prop U. that were not impacted by Prop U. Somebody mentioned the Miracle Mile. The Miracle Mile was not impacted by Prop U. It's Height District 2. It's 6-to-1 FAR. How many residential buildings have been built on the Miracle Mile? I think it's 3. How many have been built between Fairfax and La Cienega, which is the mile west of the Miracle Mile? There's one that has been built recently at the northeast corner of Crescent Heights, a high rise. There was no opposition to it. There was no NIMBYism. There was none of that, but one in an entire mile. So who do you blame for that? Who do you blame for not having any, and by the way, not a single affordable unit in that high rise? Who do you blame for that? So I think it really is important to focus on the facts and on the evidence. The professor whose dissertation was cited before made an assertion that between 1986 and 1999, the number of applications for apartment house construction in the city of LA went down at a 45-degree angle, and therefore concluded that Prop U was the cause of the housing shortage. I knew that not to be the case, so I did my own research. And the reason the applications for apartment house construction between 86 and 99 went down is because the vacancy rate went up from 2.9% to 8.9% in those same 13 or 14 years. The vacancy rate went up. That's why no bank would lend to an apartment house or a condominium developer for most of that period of time. And I knew a number of developers, including my supporters, believe it or not. I had supporters who were developers who went bankrupt during that period of time because of the vacancy rate. So stick to the facts. I know it, and that's all I will say on that. I do want to make a comment on the massive reduction of residential zoning, and I think that's one thing with which Morrow I do agree with, and I think Jenna mentioned AB 283. That was the major downzoning in the city on residential. It happened. I don't remember exactly. AB 283 was in the early 80s, I think, mid 80s. But the rezoning and the whole remaster planning of the city, the community planning process started about the time I became a councilman in 1975, mid to late 1970s. And there was a period of time there where the 1946 map for the city, which allowed for 10 million people theoretically, and the new community plans, which had taken it down to 4 million. This is at a time when the population of the city was 2.5 million. So to go from 2.5 million to 4 million, what's that, 65% increase in population, was not an unreasonable densification of the city. But what the city wanted to do is to align the zoning with reality. Now, the city has grown since then, and the city has also been rezoned since then in many areas. And the city is an organism. It continues to change. It never stays static. And I totally agree with John on and the others who said that the planning department needs to be given the resources to analyze based on the facts, to look at every neighborhood in the city. And I really think that we should not treat single-family homeowners with contempt the way we sometimes do. They're people too. Even NIMBYs are people too. And they have issues. And my experience, 40 years as an elected official, is that if you treat people with respect, they will reciprocate. If you treat people with contempt, they will reciprocate that way too. They're not bad people. They have their interests. It's not the value of their home. It's the quality of their life. I live in a house that I bought in 1976. I have made a fortune on it, okay? However, that means nothing to me until I sell my house, and I have no plans to sell my house. What do I care about? I care about backing out of my driveway and having some SOB speeding up my street and sideswiping me and landing me in the hospital, or the kids down the block who are going to get run over when they try to cross the street. Those are the things that drive people nuts. It's not the value of their house. I know that that's a good narrative, and it's a good way to have, to divide us on economic grounds, but that's an issue in every neighborhood in the city. Prop U passed by 70% in South LA and in East LA. It was not a West Side deal. everybody has a quality of life issue. I'll tell you a very brief story. My wife and I and my family went to the Monument Valley back in, I think it was 1986, actually. And we got to this town, Kayenta, Arizona. Some of you who've been to that area know the town. It's the last town you get to before you descend into Monument Valley at the Four Corners. And my wife, may she rest in peace, loved to collect local newspapers. And she comes back from the convenience store at the gas station where we had stopped, and she brings me the Hopi Navajo Observer, the daily newspaper of the reservation. And the banner headline in Kayenta was "Growth Control Sought in Kayenta." Now, the Wall Street Journal a few months later did a feature on Kayenta and noticed that and stated that it was the most remote zip code in the continental United States. And here was the banner headline saying "Growth Control sought in Kayenta." Every neighborhood has its growth issues or its quality of life issues. In Chatsworth, it's keeping the horse keeping districts. In South LA, it was keeping the arresting the proliferation of liquor stores and other stores that were not serving the needs of the community and were actually doing damage. In the West Side, it might be a high rise, and everywhere it's traffic. So let's not treat people with contempt. And I think, John, you said it earlier, you've got to engage people, and I'm not averse to a by right approach as long as we know what the by right is. The problem in LA, Gail Goldberg, the good friend of mine and the former planning director of the city, had a great quote in an article once. She said that in most cities in America, the value of a piece of land is determined by the zoning on that piece of land. In Los Angeles, it's the value of a piece of land is determined by what the, sorry, my phone's ringing. In Los Angeles, the value of a piece of land is determined by what a developer thinks he can get the zoning to be. And that's what's happened here. This is a bazaar. You walk in, why do you see these single, spot zoning high rises? It's because somebody went into the councilman's office. I don't need to tell you what's been going on at City Hall. It's a mess, and we've got to put a stop to that. And one of the ways to do it is to have, you'll never get consensus, but you can get a large sense of agreement by incorporating people's concerns. My experience is you can usually, if you listen to people's concerns, you can usually take 80% of them off the table. You won't take them all off the table, but people will feel like they've been responded to. And it doesn't matter whether they're wealthy Holmby Hills people or whether they're residents at the other end of the economic spectrum in Los Angeles. It's all about how we treat them. And I want to come back to what I said at the outset. The last 10 seconds. I believe that we can make changes to Prop U. It's already been done. Prop U is dead. It's been dead for 20 years, but we can make it a more seamless transition if it's done the right way. And that means architecture, that means design, that means sidewalks, that means all those things, but it's got to be for residential. Ground floor retail, yeah, but not office buildings and not the kinds of stuff that promoted Prop U in the first place.
Well, thank you for that. I always am happy to hear somebody everyone advocating for design. I think we have a couple of people who really want to respond or add their comments. I apologize, my internet went down at a very untimely moment. Angie, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a few things that that I said and that Zev commented on. Height District 1, which is the zone that I was referring to, is most of the parcels that I work with and develop. And so it's sort of the majority of the projects that I work on and that are linked to what I was trying to say. There is a transitional height zoning code for portions of buildings that are in the C zone that are next to R1. And so the height is limited to 25 feet. If you're within 49 feet, the height's limited to 33 feet. If you're within 99 feet, and the height is limited to 61 feet if you're within 199 feet. So part of my issue is that the codes and the entitlements to get projects done in the city of LA are so complicated and so complex that most people don't even understand all of it. It requires us to hire specialty consultants to even get through it, to know what these buildings are going to look like after a client comes to us. And so we really need to get through at least that. And that's sort of why, I've even taken to going on Instagram and just posting, look at this part of the code. It makes no sense, because things aren't really happening. And so, so I think that is something that we need to fix. And then the house that I showed wasn't the Hadid project, which I know of, which was illegal. It was one that was actually allowed. And then the city of Bel Air, after that project was built, then I think has now restricted and it cannot be built any longer. But those are the things I wanted to say. Thanks.
And I want to acknowledge that, and I appreciate you clarifying that. They're both grotesque projects, Hadid and that one.
But I think,
you,
Seth, the point here is that Angie is, working with nonprofit developers, right?
Yeah.
These are the developers that don't have a back door into City Hall, right? And
No, that's not true, Hava. The nonprofit industry is a highly organized, very smart industry. Most of the providers that Angie works for, I would argue, are amongst the most sophisticated developers in the city of Los Angeles and the city of Santa Monica. They're very good at going up to the state and advocating for their positions. In fact, I would almost argue, if you really want to have a cynical argument, that the LIHTC industry has become an impediment to the creation of affordable housing with a small a, because they have a very single purpose formula. And that's frustrating. That's frustrating because they do the best work too.
But I think the point
the
is
best
that they
architecture.
But the point is that they shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't
Well,
have
I think
to go
that's
through the
the
back
point.
door.
Well,
that's the point.
That's the point. And so, and then I also think that as architects, we live in a world of zoning and we live in a world of entitlements. But, sometimes I think that this whole conversation is a little bit, we do one little tiny piece of this equation. And, I sometimes think that the, planning has evolved in the 30 years that I've been working on it. Urban design has evolved, the architecture that results has evolved. But what I'm trying to say here is that, in some ways, the city of Los Angeles is adopting form-based zoning at precisely the moment when form-based zoning basically is no longer considered to be innovative anymore. If you go into most planning and development conversations now, you basically only want to talk about finance and economics and how do you sort of create incentives for things, and then the form-based zoning sort of sits there, and maybe it's an elephant in the room and maybe it isn't. But I guess what my point is that I think you could have almost a more powerful conversation if we talked about sort of the economic constraints of building housing, like what federal programs are needed to incentivize housing, right? What state programs are needed to incentivize housing? I mean, part of the reason we have a lot of single-family housing is because we have a mortgage tax credit, right? How many of us are like lifting our arms and saying, oh, let's get rid of that completely and totally and start subsidizing apartment construction instead of subsidizing single-family house mortgages or any type of mortgages? I mean, that might do more to sort of incentivize housing being built. So I just think that we have to have a sense of perspective on all of this. And the last point that I'll make on all of this is that I really, really think the point that some of our fellow panelists are making today about the organizing that has to occur in communities through the planning process is really the most critical part. There's an organizing part, there's an educative part, but that's where the real action is, because no matter how good our ideas are, and every single person in this table has really good ideas, it's not going to make a whit of difference if we don't basically either work with those communities or work with people who can work with those communities to basically have a conversation with them. And that map that Max is showing, I mean, I could easily argue, well, from a Marxist perspective, I could argue that that's a good thing, what that map looks like, because that means that those folks, from a dialectical standpoint, are going to basically be able to organize themselves more easily. But from other perspectives, I could definitely say that was a bad thing. So I don't know. I think that we know how to do something, and we know how to do it really well, but we have to start with listening really well and bringing our point of view to the table without fear, but also being willing to back off from our point of view and always be creative and innovative based upon what we're hearing. And I think that sometimes in these conversations as architects, because we know a lot, we also don't know enough. And we have to basically be very humble in our approach a lot of the time.
John, I completely agree. I think if we inspire a lot of blowback, we're not going to get anywhere. And we have a question for you, which is, do you think the new zoning code, and you touched on this with the form-based code, which I could not agree with you more, different conversation, different roundtable. But do you think the new zoning code will make it easier or more challenging? And in what ways?
You know, there's an old entitlement, well, I shouldn't call him an old entitlement specialist because we're all old now, but Mark Brown, who taught me a lot of things, once when the city started this whole process for the form-based code, which was, I guess, Recode LA, I should know, I was on the team at one point. He basically, and you know, the stated intention was to make the code such that we wouldn't need, it would be more certain, it wouldn't need so much discretion. He just laughed and he said it will never happen. No matter how you write a code, there'll always be a need for people to interpret it. There'll always be a need for people to wrangle with it and change it and challenge it. And I think that there's a certain amount of truth to that, but I also think that, you know, the holy grail is to create codes that are certain and that are clear, like Angie is saying. That's something we should all strive to do. But I do think that while the new form-based code will solve certain issues and make it easier to say with certainty what's allowed in certain places, I have a feeling it's going to open up all sorts of things that we haven't anticipated. And that's just in the nature of codes, because codes are not fixed. They're living, breathing documents that represent people's aspirations and objectives at given moments in time. And those moments change. Somebody said we're 2 generations beyond Prop U. Of course we're 2 generations beyond Prop U. And in 10 years we'll be 10 years beyond where we are right now. And a form-based code that had its origins in logics of 2010 is going to already look worn out and old. And that's great. That's the way it should be, because this is iterative work. Our fixes that we're coming up with today are not going to be perfect. So yes, I think we will discover that there are a lot of problems with what the city of Los Angeles is doing right now, but at the same time, there'll be some good that comes out of it. And based on the work that we've done studying it and directly, I think that it's incrementally better than what we have right now. But is it perfect? No. And I'm sure Angie in particular, when she discovers what she has to do in certain parts of Los Angeles, will find it objectionable, because she won't want to do some of the things that are in there because she's too creative and too smart. And you know what? So we'll have another conversation in 10 years about how to make it better, and that's the way it should be.
That sounds like a lot of work, John.
That's what we're here to do, work.
I'm looking forward to that day.
Can I
I
make
haven't seen that day.
a comment, just a constructive comment about going forward? I think one of the things where my thinking has changed in the last 40 years is we have zones in the city, the manufacturing zone, the M zone, which does not allow the development of residential. I guess there may be some places in the downtown area where there's been an overlay, but generally speaking, we don't allow residential development in the M zone. That's one of the things that the city ought to consider. And Max, you're in a position where if you aren't already doing this, is to take a look at that and see, you know, that there's the M1, which is a more restrictive manufacturing zone. M2 is, I think, a more intense. I'm not that well versed in it these days, but it's one of the things that I would that offer an opportunity. And by the way, with no institution, with no community opposition, I mean, relatively speaking, it would be a quick thing to do. The other one is we have P zones all over the city, parking zones. And I believe the P zone only allows surface parking. You may be able to build over it with a conditional use permit, but that's a discretionary process. One of the things we ought to look at citywide is the P zone and how that can be better utilized. We pioneered an idea back when I was a councilman where we leased the air rights over our city-owned parking lots to nonprofit developers for $1. And then they built, that was what they needed to make it economically pencil out. We should look at those two things. I think they have a potential. It's not limitless, but it hasn't been utilized because we haven't allowed it.
I think that's a really excellent point. Renee Dake Wilson actually just put in the chat that in every update to the community plan, P zones are removed.
And also
So
in
that's
the
a real
housing
opportunity.
element.
I want to ask for closing comments. I'm looking at the clock. I think this was a lively conversation. I hope we've all learned something from it. I know I have.
Well, I'll start. I'll just say thank you very much, Hava, for revisiting what I think was an emotional issue for folks back in 1986, 88. Still sounds like it's an emotional issue. I think that the big thing that I'm always interested in right now is, first of all, how to get more housing built and use every single tool possible to do it. Zoning is one of them, but zoning's a double-edged sword. And so as we approach changing it, we also have to always be anticipating what we're not anticipating when we change it. And I think that communities want us as architects to do that when we work on these projects. And it's a lot of fun to do it, but it's very hard work, as you pointed out.
Jenna, I believe you.
I just want to touch on some points that were made. I think a lot of the tools are there in the zoning that Max and I, talked about and others have touched on. So we see that there are tools. We see that there's demand to build this housing because we see how the market has responded to the ability to build in these zones today. I just want to press upon with love and offering and calling in everyone that the narrative, we do need to have conversations with our communities. Nothing I do is without deep engagement. In fact, the hardest thing for me about being a planning commissioner is the lack of dialogue with community, right? We just take it and then we got to make a decision. And that's not, in my 20 years in the public sector, how I've done policy work. I value and do try to listen to all conversations. I just invite us all to change our lens and think about racial equity and think about the harms, unintended or intended, that have come out of our policies. And it is a really hard conversation to have. And yet we need to have those conversations. And look, I'm a Jewish person and I got taught about the Holocaust. And the one thing they taught us is if you don't address how it happened and how it came to be, then you repeat history. And so all of these conversations, they need to be open and we need to listen. We also need to reframe and call in and say, let us accept the things that we have had a part in and that cause harm. And let us not blame ourselves and get defensive, but let us make change going forward and go with our eyes wide open. So listen, yes, but reframe and take ownership and responsibility and make better decisions. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
I can go next. I think I've said a lot, but I just wanted to let everybody know that the LA housing element is up and everybody should read it and support it. I think the housing element updates are a great opportunity for us to make a lot of these changes. I am on the City of West Hollywood Housing Element Task Force, I guess they call it. And City of West Hollywood and also the City of Lawndale both have not gone back to 3-to-1 FAR on their commercial boulevards. So I'm constantly talking to people and saying things, but for all the architects on this call, get out of your comfort level, talk to cities, talk to your neighbors, talk about density because density is a good thing. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, so I just wanted to say, as Zev mentioned, it's not just Prop U, but our zoning code is really a graveyard of all these crazy things, P zones, M zones, which are, huge environmental justice issue, site plan review, which LA is sort of unique in having a site plan review for 50 units or more, Q and T conditions. And a lot of this stuff just speaks to like, something in the 80s where there was like a grocery store on this block and the councilman wanted to preserve it. And I think it also speaks to is, we have had intense community planning and people involved in their communities. The problem is it's only been a select amount of residents. It's been, white, wealthy homeowners, and it's really been at the expense of, lower income people and people of color. So I think the housing element is really, and also just to say, I mean, our planning process really enshrines that inequity, how we have these, and it's nobody's fault here, but, we have planning commission meetings in the middle of the day, zoning administration hearings in the middle of the day, they're not translated. It's very difficult for, an average working person to engage in that process, and it really, enfranchises people with the resources to engage in that process. So I think, our office is all for community planning. We support the community plan process. We need to get that done. But we also need to have a citywide conversation about housing, growth, planning, and something that needs to be rooted in equity, and have all voices involved. And I really think the housing element is an opportunity to do that. And yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you. I can't thank everybody enough, both the audience and the participants. This is better than I expected. I mean, a really exciting conversation. Thank you.